Hello there, this is Jennifer Shryock. These are the RAIN sessions, a series of interviews where I'm talking to real people who have felt called or who have found their purpose through a series of events or visions, sometimes painful, sometimes beautiful, sometimes a combination. Today, I would like to introduce Gilly Cannon. Hi, Gilly.
Hi there.
Okay, let's just dive in. My first question is, what kind of work did you do before you felt called to what you're doing now?
I qualified as a teacher and I had a counselling background, and I worked as a teacher and a principal of a school, and I was also headed up a special needs program in an international school in Hong Kong.
Okay, so you worked in the UK and in Hong Kong.
Yes, I did. I
Okay.
followed my husband on his journey.
Aha. And was that work as a teacher, math specialist, principal, learning support, was that prior work fulfilling? Did you excel at it?
In retrospect, I think I did. I loved it, and I was definitely meant to be doing it when I was doing it. Um, I didn't have a lot of confidence in myself that I was good at the time, but I think looking back, I was. It's taken me a long time to come to that.
Interesting. I hear that a lot.
Hmm.
That's very interesting. So something happened that helped you to change course in some way. Did you encounter something difficult like tragedy, illness, burnout, getting fired? Was it something positive like a jolt of inspiration, a powerful idea, or something so alluring that it demanded all of your attention?
Well, it was a number of things, but mainly when we were living in Hong Kong, my father, who was in London, got very sick, and he was diagnosed with colon cancer at the age of 58, and he spent a year fighting, but it was pretty far gone when he was diagnosed, and I spent a year going back and forth to visit with him. And he died in London, and we brought our children to say goodbye to him. And it was devastating for the whole family. My sister was a doctor in the hospital where he was dying. My children were 5 and 3, and we'd been living far away, and we all felt like we'd had a limb cut off from us, and it was it, it was just not something we never thought would happen to us. And that was I think, the beginning of my search to work with the dying and the bereaved.
You say it was the beginning. So did this purpose, this call to work with the dying and the bereaved come to you as a flash, or was it a series of events or a long era that guided you?
Well, from the time that my father died, he died 20 years ago, and I now work professionally as director of children's bereavement services, and I got that job just 2 years ago. So it's taken 18 years from the time that he died until me really being in my sweet spot.
Wow. So did I've heard these stories of like books jumping off the shelves or just flashes of surprise. It may be something that you'd known about for a long time but really hadn't been brightly colored, and suddenly it was vivid for you. Did you have any experiences like that that seemed to be guiding you toward this work?
I had lots of small things that happened in terms of I was searching desperately to know where my father was once he died. And I was at an airport browsing the bookshelves, and a book, Talking to Heaven, literally fell off the shelf at my feet. And so I bought the book, and then I was like desperately trying to understand why he died so young, and shouldn't he have had more time. And I heard this little voice in my head saying, he actually had extra time. He got an extra 5 months, and you were lucky to have him for that long. And that gave me a lot of peace. I don't know where it came from. I believe that, I don't know. I just believed that it was a message for me. And I just kept being pulled towards people who were suffering and grieving and feeling like I could be present with them and not be afraid of their pain or the silence that might ensue. And I didn't have to fix it because I knew I couldn't.
Wow. I have heard stories of books literally jumping, falling off the shelves from other people I'm very close to. And like you, they bought the book and learned something, followed something there. I love what you've basically described your calling, what you were called to do, this presence, this service of not fixing things for people because they can't be fixed, but being present to them. And to me, that sounds like a healing force, even though you may not be able to heal the body.
Yes, I think that there's something so powerful about being able to companion someone through their pain. You don't get over grief. You don't get over somebody dying. The person's death and the experience that goes with it becomes a part of you. And I'm honored to be able to help children find their way through that now. But I couldn't have done it unless I'd been through it myself and helped my children through it. And experienced all the other things between my father getting sick and where I am right now. So I had to go on that journey.
Right, right. I know people who get very frustrated with this word journey, that it sounds like what I now call a spiritual bypass. Like we're trying to sound so spiritual about things that are miserable, like chronic illness or loss. And yet that's a word that keeps coming up. It feels like it fits for me. And I'm hearing it from everybody that I'm speaking to in this interview series, that it feels like a journey and one that many would take again.
Yes, and I think that doesn't mean I wasn't frustrated and I wasn't just sort of wondering what on earth I was going to do with my life. And shortly after my father died, or a year after my father died, we actually left Hong Kong, came to the United States, and I didn't have a right to work. So I found myself suddenly in a new country with small children. My husband had gone off to his new job, and I didn't know what to do with myself. And I couldn't find my own space to work. And so it was yet another experience of, well, but it led me to other experiences like volunteering. And it was through that volunteering that I actually got closer to what I'm doing today without even realizing that's where it was taking me.
Right, right. So it wasn't necessarily a deliberate move toward this purpose.
Right.
Maybe a little bit accidental. So can you walk us through these 18 years since your father died until you got hired as Director of Children's Bereavement Services?
Yeah, so, and one thing I would love to say about it is that I did, until I put my resume together to apply for this job, I didn't realize that everything I had done contributed to where I am now. But if you'd asked me to plot the course, I could never have done it. So that was, I think, one of the things that was so powerful for me when I looked at my resume was I had just been drawn to each one of those steps at that time and gone for it, even though I felt like it wasn't really what I was meant to be doing. So, so my father died, and then we had our third child, and we named him after my dad. And my husband got a new job in the States. So we came to the States. It was 10 days before 9/11. And we came to DC. And I watched the plane go through the World Trade Center with my 8-month-old in my arms, thinking, what on earth have we done coming to this crazy country? I didn't know anybody, and I didn't know how I was ever going to know anybody. And it seemed to me that everyone knew someone from high school or someone from college, or they had a connection with that their parents had shared a beach house with, and I didn't have any of those connections. So how was I ever going to make my way in this country? And so my husband had come to be a head of school here. So I started volunteering in the school because it was the one place that I was a little bit familiar with. And I started managing volunteers. And from there, I did a lot of work as the wife of head of school. So I would host people in my home, and I got to know people that way. And then actually we had a whole series of illnesses in our family. My son had 2 heart surgeries, and my husband was diagnosed with a terrible, painful illness, which led him to need brain surgery eventually. So in between all of that, I was volunteering at the school. And then when my youngest went to left preschool and went to grade school, I thought, I've got to do something more with my time. And I was just drawn to working at a hospice. So I went and trained to be a hospice volunteer, and I went and sat with people who were at the end of their life. And I visited with people, one patient actually for 2 years before she died, and I was there when she died. And it was very, I found it very rewarding, and I wasn't afraid of it. And then my husband got really sick. His pain was out of control. And he had to stop work for a while. And I was looking after him. And while I was doing that, they asked me to work at the hospice I'd been volunteering at. They asked me to manage the volunteers. So there was that volunteer piece I'd been doing in the school. And suddenly I was able to manage volunteers and use my experience as a hospice volunteer to help train the new volunteers. When my husband could no longer, he was chasing his pain with the meds, and they weren't working. They put him in hospital, and they said, we need to do surgery. So at that point, I actually gave my job up because I knew I needed to be a full-time caregiver. So I did that for about a year until he was ready to go back to work. And then I thought, what am I going to do with myself? I've just been a caregiver. I can't go back and take care of people who are dying because that's what I've been doing. But I was still very drawn to the whole end of life grief piece. And I knew that there was another hospice where they also had a program about supporting grieving children. I thought, you know what, I can't be a hospice volunteer, but I can go to the bereavement side. So then I went to approach that hospice, and I asked to be trained there. And I was trained as a hospice volunteer. And then I was trained to run good grief clubs, which are peer support groups for grieving children in schools. So suddenly there I was using my experience with children and my experience with grief and hospice, and going in and facilitating these grief support groups. And after 2 years, this job posting came up, and it was for Director of Bereavement Services at the hospice where I was volunteering. And I kept looking at it and thinking, I am so drawn to this, but it's full-time. I can't do it. I've still got young children. My husband still might be sick. I cannot do a full-time job. And every time I put it out of my mind, it kept appearing in my inbox. And so I called up the person who trained me at the hospice, and I said, I keep looking at this job, but I'm not a social worker and I don't speak Spanish, but I'm very drawn to it. And she said, well, why don't you see if maybe we can job share? And I was like, okay. And I had to go to the hospice I was doing some other volunteer work there, and I emailed the executive director in advance, and I said, I'm coming in, could I just come and talk to you about this job? I would never normally do something like that, but I was so drawn to it. It sort of overtook any fear I had. And I went into her office, and I was bubbling about this job and how I would love to do the children's part. And I'm an educator, and I've had this experience, and I've managed volunteers, which is a big part of my job. And she listened to me. She says, oh my goodness, you've got so much to offer, but I really need a full-time person. And I was like, well, I just wanted to tell you what I could do. Please, will you think about it? And if there's any other way I can help you, please be back in touch with me. And she said, well, in the meantime, why don't we make time to have lunch together? So I said, sure. So she emailed me before I got in the door of my house that she'd given me some times for lunch. And I said, yes, sure, we'll meet on Friday. 2 days later, which was 2 days before we were meant to meet for lunch, she phoned me up and she said, I've been thinking about what you said, and I've rejigged the job into 2 part-time roles. And I wonder if you would apply for the Director of Children's Bereavement Services. And I just couldn't believe it, that what I wanted and what had seemed so impossible was suddenly a possibility. And she said to me, the lunch we were meant to have, just to talk about what you might do, would you mind if I interviewed you? And I said, sure. So I met her for lunch. She interviewed me, and she said, okay, at the end of it, she said, I want to offer you the job. And I just couldn't believe how quickly this whole thing had happened. From suggesting it to her to being offered the job was 5 days. And she called one of my references while I was sitting in front of her. And she then said to me, I will call the other reference and I'll get back to you. And the following Monday, she phoned and said, okay, I'm ready to offer you the job. Will you do it? When can you start?
Gilly, this is such an amazing story to me on so many levels. And what really strikes me as I hear about this 20 years from your own bereavement to this position, this purpose, dare I say calling of supporting others in bereavement. I keep thinking of this phrase that I read in, I'm looking at the book Callings by Greg Lavoie, which I keep very close to me. It's one of my favorite books, partly because it describes all the different ways we seem to be called with great stories. And that's kind of what I'm adding to. I'm adding to the bucket of stories through this interview series. And he called this, or I'm interpreting his language of cosmic cairns. Do you know what cairns are on the trail? They're little stone piles. So if you're hiking, I'm a hiking guide. I lead retreats in nature. And so if you're on a trail that doesn't have signs, sometimes people will stack a few rocks. And you can't see the next stack, the next cairn. You just know, well, I'm where somebody has gone before. Maybe this is the trail. I had always believed that people who were called knew the vision and worked towards it. I'm going to be an astronaut. That's the most obvious, because there are certain things you have to do to become an astronaut, and they're probably not random. But you're describing things that happened along the way, not towards some vision or goal. You were just surviving, finding opportunity, contributing, being of service in the ways that felt available to you, and they seem to have led you to maybe not an astronaut, but a dear purpose, a clear calling.
Yes. And 10 years earlier, and this is something I hadn't mentioned, in honor of my dad, I decided to put a program together as a volunteer called Bringing Books of Comfort. And it was really triggered when my kids were very small, and I needed to break the news to them about their grandfather who was dying. And because I was an educator, I just thought, get a book, read a book to the children, we'll be able to have a discussion. And that led me to create this backpack of books to give to a family or lend to a family when they were grieving, so that they could begin a conversation about the person who had died. And it's not easy to talk about someone who's died and how you feel. And I felt like that's what I needed, was someone to give me the books, because when you're in that situation, you can't think straight. So if someone can give you some books and say, try these, see which one works for you. So I started this program. And of course, now I read hundreds of books at the time, and I created the program, and it's out in the community. It's in a school and some synagogues. And now, of course, in my role, I'm asked all the time about books for children who are grieving. And 10 years ago, I had started researching this, and now it's another piece of the puzzle that has sort of come together to help me be an effective director of children's bereavement services.
Right. And I'm struck once again by something you did to serve yourself. And you were doing it just genuinely to manage yourself and your loved ones, has now become of service to, dare I say, hundreds or more of others over time. I'm so fascinated by this piece of how purpose seems to come together, how we go through something, we find a way to survive it, and that serves others. and might even be a good livelihood, and and rewarding, reciprocal in more than one way.
Absolutely. And I think it's also what I have learned, one of the many things I've learned on this journey is that I don't have an official qualification to do this job. Many people who are in the similar job to me are social workers or psychologists, or they often have an education background. And and sometimes I think, how did I get here? How did I get into this place where I seem to be able to at least stand equal with these professionals when I'm not necessarily sure that I am qualified to do the job? And that is certainly a limiting thought that I revisit all the time, especially when I'm asked to go and talk to psychologists and social workers about grieving children, and I do that a lot. And I'm like, how am I going to do this? I'm not qualified to do this. They know much more than me. And yet I'm always surprised that I have something to offer them. And part of that is because of the journey I've been on. And
Yes.
if I hadn't been on it, I couldn't draw on it.
Absolutely. You bring up so many good points. Part of my work is as a resume writer, and that's how I started this piece of my business. Was really, I thought that was my calling. It turns out I have so much more to do, and writing resumes is just a little part of it. But I love being able to serve and support folks who believe they need more letters behind their name, who believe that finding the right job will be hard, and sometimes our actual experience that we didn't necessarily have that many choices about experiencing, like loss, illness. You faced both of those, and lots of them. Sometimes those are our qualifications. And then when we find the passion or the drive, some of the things that have happened to me, I was compelled to ask a question. I thought I would never speak up, and I couldn't not ask a question. And that ended up introducing me to the right people, and the next and the next and the next cairn appeared in time, because I was compelled, as you were, for a position that you weren't going to take full time. And yet it lined up and was easy. You did some work, you went outside, and this is a piece of the purpose pie that I keep hearing, is I did something I would never do, and then it works out. I love this. I'd love to hear from you how you define success, and where are you in relation to that definition?
Well, I think for me, it really is a coming together of my skills, my purpose, and my calling, my passions. And this job really knits all of those things together. And I just wake up every morning and I pinch myself that I am doing a job I love so much. And I tell people all the time, I love my job. And they look at me like I'm very odd, like, I love working with sad children. And I know I make a difference. And I think for me, that's really important, that I am helping children learn that they're not alone and that there are people like them, and that they can tell their story. Children are often called the forgotten mourners because the adults have told the story about what's happened to their loved one, and they never get asked what happened from their perspective. So the fact that we give them space and a safe place to talk about their feelings and to name them and to know that they're normal, they're not crazy. Teens think they're going crazy when they're grieving. And also, when we give them some tools for coping with those feelings, I really believe we're giving them life tools, and it really does change the course of their life. And so if I can make their life a little bit less painful, I feel like I've been successful.
You raised so many important points. I'm very close to a family who recently lost a young man. He had just turned 19, and I'm witness to his surviving sister. And wow, you've really spoken to me about some of the things I've seen, but in new language that I didn't have before. And my hope is that your sharing will reach others who, like me, are wanting to support young people who are grieving. And even I have lots of skills on how to support people, but I'm not as knowledgeable. And that's why I want to connect with people like you to learn more, to have more resources available. This is beautiful. Couple more questions. We may have touched on it. I want to give you an opportunity to speak to what now wants to come through you and your work.
Well, I want people to know that if you do what you love and you go towards what you love, it doesn't feel like work, even though it is hard work. And that it's worth keeping searching for it. I really can't, I can't believe I'm here now. I still, as I said to you, I am still pinching myself. And what wants to come through is that if I can do it, you can do it. Really, I'm, as I said, I'm not traditionally qualified for this job. And yet I'm in it and I'm advising child psychiatrists and pediatricians and developmental psychologists and all these people that I never thought that I would be able to support, and they thank me. And so what I'm saying is, if you love what you do and you believe in it, you can open the doors.
Beautiful. I thank you too. This is important work.
Thank you.
Gilly, I asked you a question. I sent a few questions ahead, and you may not have an answer for this, but I want to give you an opportunity. What legacy do you want to leave?
I really want children to be heard, and I want them to have the chance to say how they feel. One of the things that I really learned is that children are so wise. And I learned this when my father was dying. I didn't know whether to even take my sons in to say goodbye to him. And my 5-year-old really wanted to go inside. So my dad wanted to see him and my son wanted to say goodbye. So we went into the room and my son went up to my dad and he said to him, "Grandpa, are you going to die?" And my father said, "Yes, Benji, I think I am." And Benji said back to him, "Well, can I come and hold your hand?" And he went and held my father's hand. And at that point, that was the beginning for me of understanding that children deserve a voice. They're wise and they know what's going on, and they just need us to help support them do what they need to do. And so my legacy is helping children be empowered to talk about their feelings, to have difficult conversations, to be recognized as mourners in their own right. Then I'll have added value.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm certain that that legacy is in place and spreading already. I'm so honored to hear your story, Gilly. Thank you so much for sharing it with me and the viewers out there who will come across us.
Thank you so much for having me.